86 is in contention for being one of the most underrated anime of all time. It's a masterclass in atmospheric storytelling, an impressive feat of animation, a highly competent character study, and so on and so forth. Above all else though, 86 is an anime that sticks with you. But why? What is 86? It's a mecha anime, right? Well, yes, but to compare it to a show like Gurren Lagann or Darling in the Franxx, I think would be quite silly for obvious reasons. No, 86 is far more complicated. 86 is defined by its grounded world building, complicated characters, somber themes, visceral moments, the tragedy and hopelessness of the setting. My initial read of it was a psychological horror set within the backdrop of a mecha setting, whose plot was driven by a romance between two characters who never even set eyes on each other. But is that really it? I don't think so either. I think 86 is such an unforgettable anime because it transcends the mold that typical anime fit into. I think the beauty and tragedy of the show is that 86 is both timeless and contemporary. It's a scathing denunciation of not only what has been, but what is now, and always will be. The great author Ernest Hemingway once penned the famous quote, "In modern war, you will die like a dog for no good reason." I think that in all war media, there exists a fallacy where each character is part of an important cause, whose actions are a part of something greater than themselves. Thus, every action is meaningful, a necessary, typically noble sacrifice in which the end goal of a more ideal world comes ever closer. Consuming this media, you'd think the war itself, in all of its splendor and glory, hinges upon the success or failure of the ever-valiant soldier, that they are the sole protectors of freedom or safety, or their glorious homeland, or any number of concepts. This is the lie that's led millions to their pointless deaths throughout history, and continue to lure young men and women into the perpetual meat grinder which sustains the powers that be. And yet, it continues to be pushed in games, movies, and certainly anime as well. Even in war-depicting media that positions itself as anti-war, it's argued that by simply portraying combat, it is inevitably glorified. War, for most of us, especially those of us in the US, seems to be this distant concept, a problem for people and societies who don't have it as good as us. This, of course, is particularly embarrassing considering that the United States has propagated hundreds of wars across the globe since its founding, typically for its own material benefit. Can it really be said then that the situation of the global north far differs from the wretched society of the Republic of San Magnolia? I want you to hold that thought in the back of your head as we consider what war means to those who live in it, rather than those who merely conceptualize it. This was a poem penned by Rafat Al-Arir, a Palestinian professor who was right on December 6th. The beauty of the poem is unmistakable, as much as its tragedy. Just by reading, we understand that this man lived his life full of hope, beauty, and innocence. We are brought face to face with the grim reality of the injustices that define his life, and how he understood those conditions so well. We can manifestly see just how much joy and brilliance he could have brought into the world if he were able to live. But we know that he and his hope and love and genius was taken from us. For those who experience it as an everyday part of reality, war is a cruel maze where death lies around every corner. No matter how innocent, no matter how young or old, it becomes a certainty. What then becomes of life? Waiting. Many people watch 86 under the pretense that it's a seinen action anime, and under this lens, it's actually quite underwhelming, isn't it? There are action scenes, and they're flashy and dramatic, but in between there's just a lot of waiting. The characters going about their daily lives, talking, arguing, even flirting. These moments, more so than any big explosion or dramatic monologue, creates the essence of 86. It refuses to allow these human beings to be defined by and reduced to a number. Did you ever notice just how, I guess for a lack of a better word, lame each of the characters' deaths are? Unlike traditional war media, There aren't moments of any of the 86 making some big sacrifice to take down the bad guys or some blaze of glory type of deal. No, they die scared and alone, crying and in pain. There's no real dignity in death. There's no monologuing about how necessary their sacrifice was or subsequent attack born out of inspiration. It makes for far less dramatic television, but I wager that the author of 86 made this deliberate choice to just cut through all of the bullshit. 86 isn't propaganda. You won't be fed the same kind of imagery that you'll see from the glorified army recruitment media elsewhere. Though many viewers may find it particularly dull, these decisions are what elevate 86 from just another example of uninspired shonen slop to a competent anti-war narrative. War is not what truly defines these characters. Their lives do. The mundanities, like the kinds of food they enjoy eating, their hobbies, the people they have a crush on. Neither the 86 nor we are instruments of war, of capital, or of anything else except for our love. Maybe our love of people, of our God, of something as basic as a really cute cat. Because behind the showiness of the explosions and the intensity of the fighting, in war lies undeniable terror. Hopes and dreams being consumed pointlessly and endlessly. Families ripped apart, goodness and tenderness snuffed out. Glory is meaningless, as is patriotism, valor, and all the other malignant lies being sold to justify the suffering that benefits the ruling class. That is what, in no complicated terms, 86 expresses to the viewers. The 86 are doomed, thrust into hell itself through no fault of their own. They live every day thinking it will be their last, that they will just be another poor soul who is forgotten by the rest of the world, who live in ignorance and complicity, or heck, maybe they even see it as a good thing. After all, they deserve it, don't they? To be killed unceremoniously just because they happen to be born in the wrong place to the wrong group of people. Their deaths aren't recorded, and they're even stripped of the right to bury their dead. The world has failed them, and nobody cares. This is what we are told as fact, and then we're introduced to Lena. I argue that Lena is the single most complex character in recent anime, not strictly in terms of development, but rather in their contradictions. Lena represents something deeply conflicting, doesn't she? Lena is someone who became irreconcilably disillusioned by the wretched society of San Magnolia, but her livelihood is based around its existence. Lena is someone who sees past the hateful propaganda that San Magnolia propagates, but she's an upper-ranking commander of said nation's military. Lena is an empathetic person who cares deeply about the members of the 86, but her job, in the most basic sense, is to march them to their inevitable deaths. All of these contradictions would typically lead to a character who isn't particularly liked or even good, right? Because for all of the self-inflicted torment about the state of the world, for the impending doom of the 86, for all the dread she feels knowing about the evils and injustices being carried out against her fellow human beings, she is irrefutably complicit in it. By now, I hope you can maybe understand why I both revile and feel deep sympathy for Lena as a character. Her behavior seems to almost come off as a sort of liberal performative emotionalism, watching her mourn time and time again following the deaths of the 86. You can't help but think, if you care so much about these people, why are you allowing all of this injustice to happen? How could you possibly sit there in safety and comfort while your nation is responsible for their deaths, and still act like you're any better than any of the butchers who are carrying out this atrocity? If you conclude your judgments there, Lena is painted as a particularly hypocritical and vile character, which maybe isn't a completely inaccurate characterization for most of the anime. But what can she do in her situation? What options does she have? Well, what she ends up doing is the one and only moral thing that she can do in her situation. She leaves. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a short story written by American writer Ursula K. Le Guin, published in 1973. A link to a full copy is in the description. I highly recommend you read it. It's only about 5 pages, but I cannot do the writing justice. Omelas is a fictional utopian society described as being blissful and perfect. Omelas is so perfect that the author takes care to not let their ideas of what constitutes a perfect society affect the story. Instead, you're invited to insert any and all personal ideation into Omelas. Perhaps there exists dreamlike technology such as infinitely renewable energy or the cure to the common cold, or if you don't believe such things would contribute to a perfect society, then there aren't. Perhaps public transit is free and efficient, and homelessness is solved through beneficial public assistance and a healthcare system that's sensible and compassionate. Perhaps in this society, Rent-A-Girlfriend simply does not exist, and Attack on Titan has an ending that doesn't completely suck. Certainly, Nuxtaku and Hirohei have long since been ejected at max velocity into the sun. But any and all concrete examples listed by the author are expressly stated to be their own personal ideas of what it may be, ultimately leaving it to the reader to extrapolate the specifics. The only thing for certain is that everyone in this society experiences absolute joy, except for one. Because within Omelas, there is a cellar, and in this cellar, a closet, and in this closet, a child. This child, roughly 10 years old, is kept perpetually in filth, darkness, and pure unbridled misery, isolated and deprived of any and all sustenance save for a half bowl of cornmeal and grease once a day. The child can do nothing else except deteriorate in their own excrement and beg to be let out. The existence of Omelas absolutely requires them to be in these conditions, and should anyone make any attempt at relieving the child of it, even so much as providing a word of comfort, the utopia would fall away. Each person in Omelas, once they are able to process information, is brought to witness the child's miserable state. Some make attempts to rationalize the weight of this injustice. After all, surely this sorry child wouldn't be fit to survive in the outside world along with the rest of us, anyways. Others get upset, for days, maybe even months, but ultimately accept it as a necessary sacrifice to preserve their way of life. After all, better off them than me. Yet there are those who see the weight of the despair brought onto that innocent child and refuse to abide it. They are the ones who walk away from Omelas. This is the truly incredible aspect of the story, even more noteworthy than even the most unimaginably perfect conditions of Omelas itself. Where they go, nobody knows for sure. Perhaps the place does not even truly exist, but they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. So, the ones who walk away from Omelas has a lot to say, doesn't it? Beyond just the ideology of utilitarianism, there is a dreadful truth that, much like the wretched child in the basement closet, we must eventually confront. At its core, this is what 86 tells us: that no amount of privilege or comfort is worth it if it's built upon the suffering and exploitation of the less fortunate. That it's not enough to feel bad about injustice, or even to simply distance ourselves from it. We must do all that we can to put a stop to it. We've talked a lot about injustice and discrimination as it relates to 86, and while it may be a bit late to do so, I suppose there's a question that ought to be raised. Are the 86 actually oppressed? Don't get me wrong, between the systematic stripping of their status as citizens, the prison camps, the forced labor, the lack of basic human rights, the human experimentation, them being put on the front lines under-equipped to die in a war where their deaths aren't even reported, etc., all due to their race, it may seem like the author may have been trying to, if I may be so bold, make a commentary on the inherent evils of racism and fascism as an extension. And, well, here's a snippet of one of the most popular reviews of 86 on my anime list. The first problem is representations of themes, like racism and the hell of the outside world. Starting with the racism, there is barely any that made it liable to a theme I even cared about, seriously. The racism here is also used slightly ambiguous words like pig, which is used by both parties, so it makes it seem like kids screaming racial slurs after losing a game on Rocket League. In other words, something to not take seriously. This also leads me to the quote-unquote oppression that kinda stems off. It's honestly a joke, hence why I said it is like Girls' Last Tour. One moment the 86ers are reincarnating scenes from Beach episode number 41457, then next, they want to shame the Alba for oppressing them and dehumanizing them. Are these people joking? Because it makes it seem like some deranged mess that doesn't even take itself seriously. I bring this up not exclusively to point out perhaps the world's most laughable 86 take, but also because I think there's something to be examined here. It's no secret that among anime fans there exists a certain sentiment much aligned with the culture war grift. Within this belief system is an absolute rejection of any notions of political messaging, unless of course there's a character of color or a female who doesn't conform with traditional beauty standards. Above all else, this belief relies on an uncompromising denial of facts, a denial born out of necessity to avoid being confronted with difficult questions. You'll so often see comments like, "It's just an anime," and "It's not that deep," whenever any analysis is done beyond surface level observation. I've certainly seen it time and time again on my video essays. Anti-intellectualism is a disease that's poisoning both the art form and discourse surrounding anime. And it's being propagated by the same people who will unironically say facts don't care about your feelings. I'm well aware that this all sounds like overly dramatic grandstanding, but let's go back to that review again and really pay attention. This person, without a shred of insincerity, made a both sides are equally bad argument between the 86, who called the Alba names, and the Alba, who put the 86 in death camps. Then they argued how ridiculous it was that the 86 complained about the oppression and dehumanization they were subject to, since they were obviously having fun here and there, and got almost 50 likes. So, what's going on? Could we just chalk this up to media illiteracy? Maybe, but again, I think there are some potentially interesting finds that we can get to by digging deeper. What I'm getting at is, there's been a disturbing trend in recent months, where people have cast aside all empathy towards marginalized groups, both in fiction and in real life. You can see that in discussions surrounding the show. Reactionaries and supremacists don't see themselves, any part of themselves, in the 86. They are fundamentally incapable of doing so. Rather, they see themselves as the Alba group. To them, and their ilk, the oppressed groups are always the ones responsible for their suffering, and to criticize the oppressors isn't something that's even considered. When you exalt racial discrimination and violent subjugation as virtues, this becomes the singular natural conclusion that can be made. Mind you, this is the same absurd arguments that was made when they used footage of a bakery and as evidence that were lying about the unimaginable suffering they were going through. The cherry on top is bombed that bakery. In the words of Aaron Bushnell, this is what our ruling class has decided will be normal. This video started with a question: why is 86 an anime that sticks with you? I think that I answered that here, albeit in the classic video essayist style of writing 10 pages and talking about a million other things. But up until now, I've asked a lot of questions, 18 to be exact. And for all the questions I raised, both about 86 and of our world which it reflects, I didn't give many answers. How could I? Please don't be mistaken, I'm trying to make sense of everything too. I watched 86 and thought a lot about 86, and thought of our world and what 86 can teach us about it. I think it's this: that even if we're surrounded by suffering and the future itself feels like an unattainable dream, love can still exist.
Anyway, $4 a pound.